You likely saw the headline this week regarding the automotive industry, but you almost certainly missed the real story hiding underneath the layers of corporate jargon and political noise. On the surface, this looked like a standard feel-good manufacturing win another award, another commemorative ribbon, another corporate press release about excellence and quality. But that is not what just happened in reality, and it is definitely not why policymakers in Washington are suddenly feeling very nervous. What took place in Cambridge, Ontario, Canada, is not about a simple trophy to sit on a shelf. It is about power, leverage, and the quiet collapse of a strategic assumption that has shaped North American economic policy for over half a century. For decades, the legal and political framework of this continent was built on one central idea: that manufacturing excellence naturally belongs south of the Canadian border, and that everyone else is supposed to be grateful just to participate in the American-led system. That assumption just broke. And it didn't break in a secret meeting, it broke in plain sight, backed by data that cannot be spun away. Here is the official story as it was presented to the public. Toyota's Canadian operations won yet another Global Quality Award. In fact, it wasn't just another award, it was the specific global benchmark that pushed them past every other automotive manufacturing plant on Earth. More awards than any plant in the United States, more than Japan, more than Germany. The most decorated automotive manufacturing facility in the world is now in Cambridge, Ontario. If you stop the story there, it sounds like a nice human interest piece about skilled workers and good management. But that version of the story ignores the part that actually matters to the future of the North American economy. This did not happen in isolation. It happened inside one of the most integrated, politically sensitive, and economically strategic industries in existence. Autos are not just cars. From a legal and political standpoint, autos are trade agreements, complex supply chains, labor standards, and regional development policy rolled into one. The moment Canada became the global benchmark for quality inside that system, something much bigger shifted in the balance of power. I'm Daniel Kershaw, an independent legal and political journalist. I don't work for any political party, I'm not funded by any campaign, and I have no stake in any corporate boardroom. My job is to look at the court filings, the trade records, and the data to explain how the world actually works. Today, we're going to look at why this Canadian success story is causing a five-alarm fire for the rule of law and industrial policy in the United States. Later in this analysis, I'm going to reveal a specific detail buried in the recent trade negotiations that explains why Canada now holds a card that cannot be sanctioned away by tariffs. But first, we have to ask ourselves a serious question. If a trade decision or an industrial failure can change the price of your mortgage or the stability of your community, can we afford to keep listening to slogans instead of looking at the institutions? To understand why Washington is so quiet right now, we have to look at the timeline of North American integration. Since the inception of NAFTA and now under the USMCA, the deal was supposed to work like this. The United States would remain the unquestioned center of gravity. Canada would participate by supplying parts and hosting plants, taking advantage of proximity, but it was never supposed to fundamentally outshine the core. Integration was meant to reinforce American dominance, not challenge it. However, if you look at the industrial records over the last 20 years, you see a different pattern emerging. What Toyota just demonstrated is that integration does not automatically reward size or political power. It rewards execution, institutional investment, and long-term commitment. While Washington was busy fighting culture wars over tariffs and blaming workers for problems that were actually created in corporate boardrooms, Canada was making a different set of choices. Toyota's Canadian plants have been collecting these awards for years quietly, steadily, and without drama. That is part of why this moment landed so hard on the desks of American policymakers. It wasn't a fluke or a one-year spike in data. It was the cumulative result of decades of building systems that prioritize quality worker training and continuous improvement. When global automakers decide where to place the next generation of multi-billion-dollar investment, they do not listen to campaign speeches. They look at the track records. They look at which plants deliver consistently without decline. Canada just handed them a very clear answer. and it's an answer that complicates the narrative of American industrial superiority. Now put yourself in the shoes of a policymaker in Washington for a moment. You have spent years telling voters that tariffs alone will bring manufacturing home. You've argued that pressure and punishment are adequate substitutes for actual investment and long-term planning. You've claimed that loyalty can be demanded from capital rather than earned through performance. And then, a Canadian plant operating under the same continental trade framework outperforms everyone, including your own facilities. There were no speeches and no threats, just results. That is why the reaction from the Capitol has been silence. No celebration of our integrated partner, no acknowledgement of the achievement. Because acknowledging it forces a question that American policymakers have spent decades avoiding. If Canadian workers, using the same integrated supply chains, can produce the highest quality vehicles in the world, then the problem was never the trade agreement itself. The problem was our own internal priorities. That is the part you were not supposed to think about when you saw the headline. Once you start asking that question, the entire political story around manufacturing begins to unravel. For years, workers in the United States were told that their jobs disappeared because someone else cheated. They were told another government subsidized unfairly or another factory stole what rightfully belonged to them. That narrative is emotionally powerful, but as a legal and economic matter, it is incredibly shallow. When you look past the headlines and into the actual production data, a more uncomfortable truth emerges. When you give workers stability, high-level training, and a real voice in the production system, they deliver extraordinary results. But when you treat labor as a cost to be minimized rather than an asset to be developed, quality eventually collapses, no matter how many flags you wrap around the factory gate. The Canadian plants did not succeed because Canada is magically different. They succeeded because of a specific set of institutional choices. They chose long-term investment instead of quarterly panic. They chose cooperative labor relations instead of constant brinkmanship. They chose public policy that treated manufacturing as a national capability rather than a political prop. From a legal perspective, this is a red flag moment for the rule of law in industrial policy. In the United States, we have seen the financialization of the industry. This is where the ownership structure of an industry shifts priorities away from production and toward stock prices, cost-cutting, and executive compensation. In this model, plants are no longer evaluated on what they make, but on how cheaply they can make it this quarter. Training becomes an expense, maintenance becomes optional, experience becomes replaceable, and quality becomes something you try to fix later with a recall. In Canada, the incentives lined up differently. Governments treated auto manufacturing as a strategic sector. Unions retained a different kind of bargaining power that prioritized the long-term health of the plant. Training pipelines stayed intact. Companies that wanted access to the market had to demonstrate long-term commitment. Over time, that produced something rare in modern capitalism: stability. Stability is not boring. In a manufacturing context, stability is highly productive. When workers know they will still have a job next year, they invest in their craft. When managers know their success depends on sustained performance rather than short-term cost cuts, they invest in systems. When communities know a plant isn't going to vanish overnight, they support the entire ecosystem around it: the suppliers, the apprenticeships, and the local infrastructure. This is why the media framing of "Canada wins, America loses" misses the point entirely. The lesson is that industrial outcomes are not determined by slogans or nationalist theater. They are determined by the health of your institutions. For the ordinary person watching this, the person who pays taxes, worries about their mortgage, and just wants a system that plays fair. This matters in very real ways. A system that prioritizes quality also prioritizes skill. Skill brings higher wages, more stability, and safer working conditions. Contrast that with the lived reality in many American manufacturing towns. Plants reopen with massive fanfare and political photo ops, only to quietly automate, outsource, or shut down again 3 years later. Workers are asked to be flexible and grateful, while quality problems are blamed on individuals instead of the broken systems they work within. The Toyota story cuts through that fog. It shows that industrial decline is not an inevitable fate. It is a choice made in the halls of power. This brings us to the real reason this story triggered so much anxiety in Washington. It arrives at the worst possible moment for the current political narrative. Trade negotiations are tense. Tariff threats are being used as primary leverage. But suddenly, Canada holds a kind of leverage that cannot be sanctioned away, proof of performance. When Canada shows up at the negotiating table now, it does not show up as a junior partner asking for access. It shows up as the location where excellence is already happening. That changes the balance of the conversation. It means that threatening to disrupt the system doesn't just hurt Canada, it threatens the highest performing parts of the entire North American system. If you are a taxpayer, you should be asking why billions in public money are often handed out to corporations with no conditions attached, while the underlying systems of training and labor protection are allowed to erode. We have had decades of tax cuts for corporations that did not reinvest in their capacity, and decades of weakened labor protections sold to us as flexibility. All of it was justified by the claim that there was no alternative in a globalized world. What the Canadian auto sector demonstrates is that there was always an alternative. It just required political will and a different understanding of who actually creates value in an economy. Now, here is the part that should really make you stop and think. This success in Canada didn't require breaking away from the global economy. It didn't require isolationism. It happened inside an open, integrated, and competitive market. This means the excuse that global competition makes high standards impossible simply does not hold up to legal or factual scrutiny. It was never about feasibility. It was always about priorities. For the working families across this continent, the stakes of ignoring this lesson are enormous. When policymakers fail to learn from these benchmarks, insecurity becomes permanent. Jobs become temporary. Skills become obsolete faster than people can adapt. Entire regions are left oscillating between false hope and quiet decline. None of that is inevitable. It is the result of a system that has decided who is worth protecting and who is expected to absorb all the risk. The silence from American political leaders is not just about embarrassment, it's about uncertainty. Acknowledging this success opens a door. They do not control a door that leads to questions about labor rights, public investment, and the role of the state in shaping markets. Those are questions that challenge decades of established ideology, and they are questions that cannot be answered with a slogan or a 30-second campaign ad. As we look at the logic on display here, it applies everywhere, not just in car factories. It applies to healthcare, education, logistics, and energy. Any sector where quality, continuity, and human skill matter. When systems are designed around short-term profit extraction, quality deteriorates. When they are designed around long-term value creation, quality improves and spreads. The mirror that this story holds up to Washington is uncomfortable because it reflects choices, not fate. It shows what happens when a system is aligned around long-term value rather than short-term extraction. The question now is whether anyone in power is willing to look into that mirror honestly. Because once you do, it becomes very hard to go back to pretending that decline is unavoidable or that workers simply need to try harder inside systems that were designed to fail them. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this. Does the success of a different model right across our border change how you view our own industrial policies? Do you believe that stability and craftsmanship are still possible in our current economic system, or have we moved too far toward short-term gains? Let's have a serious discussion in the comments. If you want to continue following the facts and the law, and if you want to understand the deep structures of power that the mainstream headlines often miss, I invite you to subscribe and join us for our next analysis. I'm Daniel Kershaw, and I'll see you in the next one.